Today, we're digging into a classic of social psychology, published in 1895, Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd. And to ease into it, let's start with things happening around us in daily life. Like a recent case where a certain brand ran into a small controversy. And even though the company hadn't said a word yet, the entire internet was already in full-blown chaos. A friend of mine, someone who is usually very gentle, ended up trading dozens of angry comments with strangers in the thread. And afterward, he couldn't even understand himself, wondering how he completely lost control of his temper in that moment. Think about other situations too. At a concert, a normally budget-minded student might spend a big chunk of money on a glow stick and scream along with the crowd until their voice breaks. Or during the pandemic, when experts clearly said there was plenty of salt, yet people still dragged home several bags just in case. Or even something as simple as voting online for the best TV show, where you originally liked Show A. But after seeing everyone praise Show B, you ended up voting for B as well. All these things seem unrelated on the surface, but at their core, they share the same pattern. The moment we blend into a group, something in our mind shifts. And Le Bon had already explained the rules behind that shift more than a century ago. You might wonder what a book written in Europe over 100 years ago has to do with us today. But if you think carefully, you'll realize that while technology changes and society changes, the nature of groups hardly changes at all. Le Bon said crowds are easily infected by emotion. And today's social media trending topics and comment section dog piles are perfect examples. And he said that crowds don't need reasoning. They only need simple slogans, which is exactly why the most viral ads and the most persuasive speeches rely on one emotionally charged line instead of complicated logic. But it's important to clarify that The Crowd is not a book insulting ordinary people as stupid. It's more like a user manual that dissects how group thinking works. Because Le Bon doesn't lecture, he crouches down and observes, asking why a collection of smart individuals can turn into a confused mass once they gather, and why we sometimes follow along with things we clearly know don't make sense, simply because everyone else is doing them. Of course, we need to read this book with our own judgment too. Le Bon lived in 19th century Europe, so he inevitably carried the biases of his era, such as exaggerating how race determines group behavior, which is obviously flawed. And his overall view of crowds is quite pessimistic, as if groups are doomed by nature. But none of this undermines the book's value. Just like looking at an old photograph isn't about laughing at old-fashioned clothes, but about seeing what hasn't changed across time. So next, following Le Bon's line of thinking, let's break down what a crowd actually is, how it differs from simply gathering a group of people together, and what invisible shifts happen in our minds the moment we become part of a crowd. Because once we understand these things, we can stay a bit more clear-headed and a bit less blindly driven whenever we find ourselves inside a group. Let's start with a simple distinction, because when you squeeze into a subway car during rush hour, with dozens of people standing there, scrolling their phones and thinking about what to eat after work, that scene technically doesn't count as a crowd in the way Le Bon defines it. But imagine the subway suddenly loses power, and in the darkness, someone shouts that the carriage is collapsing, and people instantly start pushing, shoving, and fighting their way toward the doors. And at that moment, according to Le Bon, that is when a true crowd forms. The difference between these two situations isn't about how many people are present, but about whether the state of those people has fundamentally changed. When the subway runs normally, everyone remains an individual with independent thoughts, and your emotions, your judgments, and your decisions all come from your own experiences. But once chaos breaks out, the conscious part of your personality feels like someone hit the delete key, and what takes over is a collective surge of unconscious instinct. You stop worrying about whether pushing might hurt someone. You stop questioning whether the carriage is actually collapsing. and you simply move in the same direction as everyone else, terrified of being the one left behind. Le Bon gives a very vivid definition of a crowd, saying that it is a new kind of entity in which conscious individuality disappears and unconscious instinct takes the lead. And it's like tossing candies of different flavors into a jar, shaking it hard, and ending up with a single blended taste where you can no longer tell any flavor apart. Once someone enters a crowd, they lose their uniqueness and become a tiny piece controlled by the will of the whole. And to understand this new entity better, we need to look at its counterintuitive features and how those features turn smart people into foolish ones. A first feature, and the most important one, is that the intelligence of a crowd sinks to the lowest level among its members. You might think a group should always have a few smart people who can hold up the average. But Le Bon says, crowd intelligence is not the average, it is the minimum. Just like a group pulling on a rope might produce less force than the strongest person could produce alone, instead of more. Take Newton as an example, a towering genius in human history, master of calculus and the discoverer of gravity, someone whose rational mind was far beyond ordinary people. But if you drop him into a mob during the French Revolution, and he saw people waving flags and shouting to overthrow the monarchy, and heard fiery speeches declaring the king the enemy of the people, there's a good chance he would get swept up in the passion and even join in storming the Bastille. Why? Because inside a crowd, reasoning becomes unnecessary, and people no longer ask why they should take action. They only need the comfort of knowing everyone else is doing it. Le Bon compared this state to early humans, who didn't wonder why thunder happened, but simply followed the tribe in worshiping the mountain gods. And in the same way, people inside a crowd don't weigh consequences. They just act on impulse alongside everyone else. And we can see the same thing around us today. A few years ago, when a certain celebrity's scandal broke, the entire internet exploded instantly. And a friend of mine who works in law, a guy, normally calm, logical, and precise when analyzing cases, was also in the comments yelling, "Ban him forever, never give him a comeback." And when I later asked whether he knew the full truth of the situation, he paused and admitted that he didn't, saying he simply saw everyone else attacking the guy and assumed he must be in the wrong. And that's exactly it. Even well-trained, rational people can sink in emotion and intelligence the moment they dissolve into a crowd. The second major trait is that a crowd's emotions tend to swing to extremes. And unlike an individual, whose feelings move like a slow, steady river with moments of joy, anger, sorrow, and happiness, but rarely violent spikes, a crowd's emotions behave more like a volcano, either completely suppressed or erupting in explosive madness with no middle ground at all. Le Bon gives the example of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre during the French Wars of Religion, where in 1572 the Catholics in Paris suddenly turned on the Huguenots, and within just a few days, tens of thousands were killed. Many of the killers were ordinary people, bakers, blacksmiths, tailors, people whose religious teachings clearly told them to love thy neighbor. Yet once they were swept up by the emotions of the crowd, they transformed into cold, ruthless executioners, killing while shouting that they were doing it for their faith, and genuinely believing they were carrying out some form of justice. Because once the crowd had labeled the Huguenots as the enemy, any extreme act against them became, in the crowd's eyes, a justified form of revenge. And this emotional extremism is even more common in today's online world. Take a TV drama as an example. Fans who love it will praise it as a masterpiece, calling it the best work of the past decade and saying you're missing out if you don't watch it. Those who don't like it will trash it as absolute garbage, accusing the director of being incompetent and the actors of having no talent, claiming the show is painful to watch. Almost no one says, the show has strengths and weaknesses. Some parts were good, but some parts could be improved. Because within a crowd, neutrality becomes a kind of betrayal. You're either on this side or that side, with no room in the middle. And then there are fan groups. Students who usually live frugally will suddenly spend thousands of yuan at once to buy stacks of albums or pump up data just to boost their idol's ranking. If they see someone criticizing their idol, even if it's a mild and objective critique, they'll immediately swarm the person, firing back with the harshest insults. It's not that they don't understand the idea of rational fandom, but within a crowd's emotional atmosphere, extreme devotion becomes proof of love and extreme defense becomes a fan's duty. Once emotions take over, there's no space left for rational voices. The third trait is that a crowd's behavior becomes unconscious, meaning people can do something wrong and not even feel guilty about it. Why does that happen? Because being part of a crowd creates the illusion that the law won't punish all of us. So when everyone is doing the same thing, each individual feels the responsibility isn't theirs alone, but something shared by the group. Even when they commit an illegal act, they shift the blame to the crowd rather than themselves. During the Paris Commune of 1789, someone took the lead in burning down Louis XVI's palace, and citizens who normally wouldn't dare touch other people's belongings suddenly rushed in, looting and burning furniture. They told themselves it was part of the revolution, a way of resisting the king, and completely forgot that what they were doing was destruction and theft. Later, when someone asked one of the participants, "Weren't you afraid of being arrested?" he said, "Everyone was grabbing things. Why should I be scared? Even if someone got caught, it would be all of us together, not just me." This kind of unconscious behavior is extremely obvious in today's online mob attacks as well. Whenever someone posts a controversial video, people immediately dox them, call their phone to harass them, or flood their social media with insults. Many of these people are polite and well-mannered in real life. But online, where no one knows who they are and everyone else is attacking, they suddenly feel their actions are justified, even noble, as if they're defending justice. They never stop to consider that a single cruel comment might push someone into despair, because the crowd's unconscious mentality has erased their sense of responsibility. So by now, it should be clear that what Le Bon calls a crowd isn't simply a large number of people. It's a psychological state, one that strips individuals of rationality, inflates their emotions, and dissolves their sense of responsibility. And that leads us to the question, if this state isn't innate, how exactly are a crowd's thoughts and behaviors formed? Why can some people manipulate a crowd's emotions so easily? Let's take these questions and explore how a crowd's mindset is actually fed and constructed. In the last part, we figured out that a crowd is not just a large number of people gathered together, but a special psychological state where individuals walk in and immediately start to change. Their intelligence drops a level, their emotions swing to extremes, and their behavior becomes unconscious. And that naturally leads to a new question. All those seemingly unified ideas in a crowd, like, "We must resist this," "We have to seize that," or "This person deserves to be condemned," where do they actually come from? And are they the result of everyone calmly discussing and reaching agreement? Le Bon's answer is very clear. Absolutely not, because the crowd's ideas are gradually laid down like layers of groundwork, and then suddenly ignited at the right moment, meaning the ideas are fed into the collective mind rather than produced by the crowd itself. To understand how this feeding process works, we first have to distinguish between two T-forces slow variables that act like seeds quietly taking root, and fast variables that strike like a lit match and instantly set those seeds on fire. Slow variables shape the long-term foundation of how the crowd thinks, and the first slow variable is race. Because Le Bon believed that each race carries deep, hardwired mental habits, much like different species of trees that grow into different shapes, even when planted in the same soil. This mental inertia heavily restricts what a crowd can think or accept, so even when confronted with new influences, the crowd's reactions never really escape the boundaries set by its inherited frame. For example, when faced with social transformation, Germanic peoples tend to move gradually while considering order and tradition, whereas Latin peoples lean toward radical breaks and are easily stirred by calls for total change. This isn't about which race is superior. It is simply that culture, customs, and long histories create default directions of thought, just like how different regions produce different temperaments that quietly shape how a crowd responds when conflicts arise. The second slow variable is tradition, and Liban emphasized that crowds are stubborn guardians of tradition because tradition provides a deep sense of safety, like an old chair that may be worn out but still feels reassuring the moment you sit on it. Without that old chair, a crowd often feels lost or afraid, which is why even after the fall of the Qing dynasty, some people still argued for restoring the monarchy, believing life felt wrong without an emperor. Even today, some outdated customs in things like wedding ceremonies continue to exist not because they are practical, but because the older generation insists on keeping them, saying this is what our ancestors passed down. Crowds cling to tradition because familiar mistakes feel safer than unfamiliar truths, and this attachment makes them naturally reject new ideas while allowing old ideas to root themselves even more deeply. The third slow variable is education, and this often surprises people because Laban argued that better schooling does not necessarily make crowds more rational. Instead, certain types of education make crowds easier to manipulate. 19th century France relied on rote memorization, so students remembered dates and events but never learned to question causes or consequences, and they recited literature without ever exploring meaning or forming their own opinions. This produced people who wait for standard answers rather than thinking independently, which is the perfect raw material for crowd psychology. And the same pattern still happens today when people shaped by rote learning simply follow online trends, instead of verifying information for themselves. If slow variables build the foundation of crowd thinking, then fast variables provide the explosive materials that make crowd thinking take shape quickly. And the first fast variable is vocabulary and formulas. Laban noticed that crowds cannot follow complicated logic, but they are extremely vulnerable to vague and beautiful words. Freedom, justice, happiness, the future words that sound inspiring, precisely because they are undefined enough for everyone to project their own desires onto them. That is why a slogan like chasing poetry in distant places can move so many people, even though one person imagines traveling to Tibet, while another imagines quitting their job to open a bookstore, because the vagueness allows every mind to fill in its own dream. On the other hand, if you say, we're going to Tibet on a 5,000 yuan budget, taking this exact route, far fewer people feel inspired because the concrete details limit imagination instead of unleashing it. The second fast variable is illusion, because crowds prefer beautiful lies over harsh truths, since truth often means admitting one's own powerlessness, while illusions offer comfort and hope. In the Middle Ages, for instance, people believed Joan of Arc was sent by God to save France, even without evidence, simply because they desperately needed a hero during a time of national humiliation. The same thing happens today when elderly people buy unreliable health supplements. It's not that they are foolish, but that the illusion of, this will help you live longer and won't burden your children, feels far more comforting than the truth of needing exercise, medical checkups, and discipline. Crowds cling to illusions because facing their own vulnerability is much harder than believing in a hopeful fantasy, even if that fantasy is false. The third and most decisive fast variable is the absence of rationality, and Laban repeatedly warns that trying to reason with the crowd is pointless because the crowd's ideas are formed through emotion, not logic. If you explain something with step-by-step reasoning, because A leads to B and B leads to C, the crowd simply tunes out. But if you say, "This is outrageous. We must not tolerate it. Follow me, and we will reclaim our dignity." The crowd immediately explodes with passion. A speaker who explains economic logic may put the audience to sleep, but one who shouts, "Brothers, follow me, and next year your income will double," will instantly receive thunderous applause. Crowds do not need complex analysis. They need simple promises, emotional resonance, and a sense of shared excitement. At this point, you may be wondering, since crowd ideas are fed rather than created, who is doing the feeding, and who is quietly laying down the slow variables and striking the match of fast variables to ignite unified crowd thinking? The answer is the leader, the person capable of steering, shaping, and inflaming the emotions of the crowd. And next, we will break down the leader's playbook to understand how they become the conductor of the collective mind. In the previous section, we figured out that the ideas a crowd holds do not come from themselves, and instead are the result of slow-moving variables laying the groundwork and fast-moving variables igniting everything. And these variables never operate on their own, because there always has to be someone pushing them forward. And that someone is the leader Gustave Le Bon was talking about. When we mention a leader, many people immediately picture someone smart, educated, and strategic. But Le Bon tells us that the kind of leader who can truly control a crowd is not necessarily the one with the highest IQ, but the one who is best at steering the rhythm and shaping the emotional flow of the masses. Le Bon paints a very clear portrait of this leader, saying they often carry a hint of obsession and hold on to what they believe with an almost fanatical persistence. And even when evidence is laid out right in front of them, they refuse to waver. For example, during the French Revolution, Robespierre firmly believed in Rousseau's theory of popular sovereignty, and he was so determined to build the ideal society, he envisioned that even killing tens of thousands would not make him hesitate. And the same thing happens today with certain opinion leaders online, because once they decide a viewpoint is correct, no matter how many people argue against them or how much evidence contradicts them, they'll keep repeating their stance day after day without ever backing down. Why does this kind of stubbornness actually move the crowd? It's because the crowd fears hesitation more than anything. And when everyone is confused and unsure what to believe, a firm voice gives them a sense of certainty. And even if that voice is wrong, the crowd will cling to it the way a drowning person grabs a floating piece of wood. And these leaders manage to control the crowd not through complex theories, but through three simple yet incredibly powerful manipulation codes. The first code is assertion, where they never explain and simply give conclusions. A leader never negotiates with the crowd and never spends long paragraphs explaining why something should be done, but instead delivers conclusions in the shortest and most absolute tone possible. For example, when an influencer recommends a product, they never say, "This might be good because ingredient A helps your skin and ingredient B keeps it hydrated," but instead say, "You have to buy this, and you'll absolutely regret it if you don't. And everyone who tried it says it's amazing." In online controversies, these opinion leaders don't analyze the full context either, because they simply declare, "This person is wrong and must apologize," or "This thing is a cover-up and we should all boycott it together." Why is assertion more effective than explanation? Because the crowd has no patience for complicated logic, and as Le Bon says, the mind of a crowd is like the homework notebook of a school kid. It only has room for simple answers like right or wrong, and has no capacity for statements like maybe, possibly, or it depends. When the leader gives a firm conclusion, the crowd doesn't need to think at all. They just need to agree, and this effortless feeling is extremely attractive to them. But if a leader says something like, "I need to study this more," and there may be several possibilities, the crowd immediately feels the leader is unreliable and turns toward someone with a much firmer voice. The second code is repetition, because when you say something 100 times, it becomes the truth. Leaders know very well that the crowd's memory is short, and a single conclusion can't leave a deep impression. So they must rely on endless repetition to drill the idea into the unconscious mind of the crowd. Think of those familiar commercials that keep saying one slogan over and over again on TV and in elevators. And even if you think it's silly at first, after hearing it enough times, you remember it automatically. And when you actually have to buy something, that slogan is the first thing that pops into your mind. The same goes for slogans repeated in speeches, articles, and social media posts, because the leader keeps saying them today, tomorrow, and the next day, and eventually, the crowd feels the statement must be correct simply because they've heard it so many times that they forget to question it. Le Bon compares this power of repetition to water dripping on stone, because a single drop of water is weak and leaves no mark. But if it falls in the same spot day after day, it eventually wears the stone down, and a leader's words are exactly like that. Drop of water one instance changes nothing, but repetition reshapes the crowd's beliefs. And the key is that repetition doesn't need logic. It only needs presence, and even a nonsensical sentence can become a truth if it's repeated enough times. The third code is contagion, where the leader first convinces a small group and then spreads the belief to everyone else. A leader never tries to persuade the entire crowd at once. Instead, they identify a group of people who are easy to influence, turn them into believers, and let those believers spread the idea outward like a chain reaction. Think about concerts. The performer never tells the entire arena to stand up right away. They interact with the fans in the front rows first, and once those fans stand up and wave their glow sticks, the rest of the audience instinctively follows. Online controversies work the same way. The opinion leader first mobilizes their core followers to repost and comment, and after enough activity builds up, ordinary users see that so many people are talking about it and join in without thinking. The essence of this contagion is conformity, because Le Bon says the crowd behaves like a flock of sheep, and as long as one sheep runs in a certain direction, the others will follow, even if the path leads off a cliff. When a few people express support for the leader, others in the crowd fear being isolated, and feel that if everyone believes something and they don't, they'll look like an outsider. So they follow along too, and this process spreads incredibly fast, just like catching a cold, because once one person coughs, soon the whole office is coughing, and once one person accepts the leader's idea, the whole crowd accepts it shortly after. Beyond these three manipulation codes, leaders also hold one more deadly weapon, which is prestige. And prestige acts like a halo that makes whatever the leader says or does easier for the crowd to accept. Without prestige, no matter how correct or reasonable the leader's message is, it's hard to persuade the crowd. Le Bon divides prestige into two types: acquired prestige and personal prestige. Acquired prestige comes from wealth, status, and power, and that's why a boss may say something completely illogical, and the employees still listen attentively, and why a government official can make a simple statement and the public treats it as important. Personal prestige, on the other hand, comes from charisma, presence, and moral appeal, and this is why certain celebrities inspire extreme devotion from fans, even if they don't have money or power, and why historical figures like Gandhi, dressed plainly and holding no official position, could still influence countless people through their personal character. But prestige is never permanent, because it is fragile like thin glass that shatters instantly once a crack appears. A celebrity may be worshipped by fans, but once a scandal breaks, their prestige collapses overnight. An official may have had a great reputation, but once corruption is exposed, that prestige disappears instantly. So a leader must constantly maintain their prestige and protect their public image, because once that image collapses, their ability to control the crowd disappears with it. Now that we understand how leaders use assertion, repetition, contagion, and prestige to influence crowds, another question appears: do different types of crowds respond to these manipulations in the same way? For example, Would a criminal mob and a jury react differently because their crowd natures are not the same? In the next section, we will break down 4 typical crowd types and examine how each group behaves differently when facing manipulation. Before this, we already figured out how leaders use the cycle of assertion, repetition, and contagion to steer and manipulate crowds. And yet, if you look closely, you'll notice something very interesting. Even when exposed to the same kind of manipulation, different groups can end up behaving in completely different ways, with some drifting toward violence while others maintain at least a shred of rational judgment. And this contrast is very much like nurturing different plants with the same water and fertilizer, only to find that each still grows in its own unpredictable way. Because different types of crowds operate under different psychological rules, the triggers that affect them and the ways they fall into certain patterns also vary significantly. And Gustave Le Bon, in his book, analyzes 4 classic kinds of crowds. So let's break down their behavior manuals, one by one, starting with the first type, the criminal crowd, which, Le Bon emphasizes, is not a gathering of born criminals, but rather a group of ordinary people who have been pushed into brutality through malicious suggestion. When we talk about criminal crowds, most people imagine ruthless murderers. But Le Bon reminds us that many members of such crowds were originally law-abiding individuals, bakers, shoemakers, farmers, and they ended up committing violent acts only because, within the crowd, they lost their sense of responsibility and moral judgment under the pressure of suggestion and emotional contagion. The most striking example is the September massacres during the French Revolution in 1792, when Parisian citizens stormed prisons and slaughtered inmates, leaving thousands dead within a matter of days. And yet many of the killers were usually gentle, ordinary townspeople who shouted for the revolution and for the people while they carried out the killings. Because someone kept repeating the message that these prisoners were enemies of the revolution, traitors to the people, and that failing to eliminate them would doom the revolution entirely. Under that constant suggestion, they no longer felt they were killing human beings. They felt they were defending justice, defending the revolution, doing something righteous. And the irony is that after the massacre, some even cleaned up the scene voluntarily, or handed over their spoils, such as clothing taken from the prisoners, to the authorities, as if proudly proving they had done nothing wrong. Le Bon stresses that the fundamental characteristic of the criminal crowd is its unconscious cruelty. Because unlike professional criminals who plan meticulously, these people act impulsively under the emotional surge of the group, and even after doing terrible things, they genuinely believe they were carrying out justice. Much like modern online mob attacks, where someone starts hurling insults, others follow blindly, people dig up private information, and everyone feels they are protecting justice while completely ignoring the fact that they are committing a crime. The second type is the jury, a group that appears to be rational and impartial, but often makes decisions based more on feelings than on law. Because a jury, at its core, is still a crowd, and like any crowd, it is easily influenced by emotion, suggestion, storytelling, and surface impressions. To begin with, juries are heavily swayed by the defendant's appearance. And if a defendant looks clean, polite, harmless, or fits the role of a sympathetic figure, an elderly person, a pregnant woman, or a mother with a child, the jury tends to be more lenient, sometimes even in the face of solid evidence. While someone who looks intimidating or has a criminal record may be judged as guilty before the facts are even discussed. Le Bon recounts a case of a young and very attractive woman accused of theft. And although the evidence was undeniable, the jury couldn't believe that such a lovely girl would steal. So they declared her not guilty purely because of her appearance. Juries are also extremely susceptible to emotional stories. So a skilled defense attorney won't lecture them with legal clauses, but will instead tell a moving, personal narrative. Perhaps the defendant was orphaned, raised by a frail grandmother, committed the offense only to pay for medical expenses. Or maybe the victim had been domineering or abusive, making the defendant's reaction seem understandable. And such stories instantly activate sympathy, overriding the legal framework the jury is supposed to follow. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that minority opinions within a jury are nearly powerless. Because once the majority leans toward guilt or innocence, the few dissenters usually get persuaded, pressured, or simply conform to avoid conflict. Which is why LeBon argues that the jury's rationality is often an illusion. Its decisions are driven by emotion much more than by judicial logic. The third type is the voter crowd. And LeBon points out that when voting, people often think they're choosing policies. But what they're really choosing is a feeling, a sense of trust, identity, or emotional resonance. Because voters, like any crowd, are highly susceptible to slogans, reputation, and emotional cues. A clever candidate knows they don't need to master complex policy details. Because voters rarely want to hear about industrial restructuring, fiscal planning, or employment projections. But they do respond powerfully to simple and uplifting messages, such as raising wages, improving schools, and making life better for everyone. Even if these promises contain no real implementation plan at all, voters are also strongly influenced by the prestige of a candidate. Celebrities, wealthy individuals, former high-ranking officials, or anyone with an aura of success can attract support simply because people assume they must be capable. While lesser-known candidates, no matter how well-crafted their plans, struggle to win trust. And voters are especially vulnerable to negative propaganda, rumors about infidelity, corruption, or personal scandal, even when completely fabricated, can significantly shape voter perception. Because crowds instinctively trust negative information more than positive. That's why LeBon says that voter-based democracy often feels free and autonomous. But beneath the surface, it is frequently guided and manipulated by emotional currents set by others. The fourth type is Parliament, which looks like a place of democratic debate, but in practice often operates under the dominance of a few leaders, because Parliament, too, is a crowd. And crowds instinctively follow strong personalities rather than ideas. Many parliamentary debates are largely ceremonial, because key decisions are often made by party leaders or influential figures long before the formal discussion begins. And ordinary representatives, despite having the right to speak, usually just go through the motions. And if one tries to oppose the prevailing direction, they are either pressured by leadership or quietly sidelined through group dynamics, because crowds dislike conflict and prefer uniformity. Parliamentarians are also easily swayed by emotional rhetoric. If a leader passionately declares that a bill serves the nation's future or the people's well-being, many representatives will follow along without deeply analyzing the actual content. And conversely, if someone labels a proposal as harmful to the public, even a bill beneficial for long-term development may be rejected outright. And at the end of the day, party interest usually outweighs national interest. So if party leaders support a bill, members tend to support it. And if the party opposes it, members will fall in line and vote against it, regardless of personal judgment. LeBon argues that parliamentary democracy often turns into a one-man show performed by a few leaders, while the majority of representatives function more as voting machines than independent thinkers. After examining these four types of crowds, we can see that whether we're talking about criminal crowds, juries, voters, or parliaments, they all share the fundamental characteristics of crowds: diminished rationality, emotional dominance, and susceptibility to manipulation, even though their behaviors differ because their purposes and compositions differ. But this leads to a deeper question. Are LeBon's views entirely correct, or do they have limitations? Does the crowd provide timeless insight, or does it also contain blind spots? And that is what we'll explore next as we look critically at both the strengths and weaknesses of LeBon's ideas. When people read The Crowd, many of them feel a chill running down their spine, because the traits that Le Bon described more than a century ago seem to predict today's online flame wars, impulsive mass buying, and sudden reversals of public opinion with uncanny accuracy. Yet if we treat this book as absolute truth, we fall into another kind of misunderstanding. Since every classic carries insights shaped by its time, as well as limitations shaped by its era, and The Crowd is no exception. So what we need to do is absorb its essence while filtering out its flaws. And before talking about its limitations, we should first look at the ideas in the book that feel almost prophetic even today, and still help us understand many social phenomena. The first insight is that emotional contagion in groups becomes infinitely amplified in the digital age. Because although Le Bon was observing how newspapers and public speeches stirred emotions, his idea that emotion spreads like a plague has been taken to the extreme by social media, where a controversial news item may start with only a few extreme comments, but through reposts, replies, and likes, the emotion spreads rapidly. Some people join in to curse, some to cry, some to panic, and even when authorities later clarify the truth, the emotional wave is difficult to calm down. And just like the medicine hoarding frenzy during the pandemic, where a few people whispered in group chats that supplies were running out, the rumor snowballed until everyone rushed to pharmacies regardless of whether they needed medicine or not, which is almost identical to what Le Bon described when he said groups lose rationality once emotions take over. The second insight is that fragmented information manipulates crowds more efficiently than systematic knowledge ever could. Because while Le Bon criticized 19th century cramming-style education for failing to cultivate independent thinkers, the fragmented, conclusion-first consumption of today makes deep thinking even harder. And the short videos and snack-sized news we scroll through each day mostly offer ready-made conclusions. This thing is toxic. That person has terrible morals. This incident must be a conspiracy, while very few people bother to ask where the evidence is or whether the logic holds. And when a celebrity is accused of being arrogant, a heavily edited clip can ignite collective fury in seconds, with few people watching the full context or waiting to hear the person explain, perfectly aligning with Le Bon's idea that crowds do not need complex reasoning. They only need simple conclusions. The third insight is that the power of reputation in leadership has never gone out of style. Because what Le Bon called prestige, the ultimate weapon of a leader, has simply evolved into modern persona building, where celebrities, influencers, and entrepreneurs carefully construct flawless public images. Some project dedication, some project kindness, some project genius, and as long as the persona holds, fans trust them unconditionally and buy whatever they promote regardless of quality. But once that persona collapses, whether due to scandal or fraud, the reputation, accumulated over years, can evaporate instantly, and regaining public trust becomes nearly impossible. Matching Le Bon's claim that once prestige is destroyed, it is almost impossible to rebuild. These insights are what elevate The Crowd beyond its own era and make it a foundational text for understanding collective behavior. But at the same time, we must stay clear-eyed, because buried in Le Bon's writing are also the biases of 19th century Europe, and these limitations must be recognized and avoided. A first limitation is that his view of crowds is excessively pessimistic, reducing them to foolish, violent, easily manipulated masses, while ignoring the tremendous positive power that crowds can unleash when guided by purpose or justice. Because during the War of Resistance against Japan, countless ordinary people formed courageous groups that sacrificed their lives for national survival. And during the pandemic, volunteers and medical workers risked their safety to protect the public. And environmental and charitable groups continue to push society forward with their actions, demonstrating that crowds are not mindless monsters, but can become powerful forces for good when properly guided. And Le Bon's dark conclusions largely stem from witnessing the violence of the French Revolution and the chaos of the Paris Commune. experiences that left him blind to the noble acts that crowds can achieve when driven by righteous beliefs. The second limitation is his heavy reliance on racial determinism, which is filled with prejudice. Because Le Bon believed that groups of different races were born with fixed temperaments claiming, for instance, that Latin peoples were easily agitated, while Germanic peoples were more rational, an idea that is clearly wrong. Since group behavior is shaped by environment, education, culture, and belief rather than by blood or race, and even within the same nation, such as the Chinese people, crowds have shown bravery and unity in wartime and reason and tolerance in peaceful times. So no one can say this race's crowd is inherently a certain way. And Le Bon's claims reflect the colonial era mindset. When many European scholars believed in white superiority ideas that obviously contradict modern values of equality. The third limitation is that Le Bon underestimated the impact of individual awakening on group behavior, because he believed crowds would always be manipulated and could never wake up. Yet he failed to foresee that with rising education levels and easier access to information, more and more people would learn to think independently. And today, when social controversies arise, some people proactively verify sources, identify logical gaps, or remind others not to dogpile blindly. And these awakened individuals are gradually changing how crowds behave, making them less like puppets and more capable of reason. Just like when a case of school bullying surfaces online, people no longer simply shout, "The bully deserves to die." But many now analyze the family and school factors involved and call for stronger protection systems, showing that a crowd's rationality can improve. And Le Bon's belief that crowds are forever ignorant is simply too absolute. One more point is that Le Bon's view of education is also incomplete. Because he believed education only creates obedient masses, failing to see that real education teaches independent thought, since modern education promotes not only knowledge, but also critical thinking and logical reasoning, allowing individuals to stay clear-headed within any group. And Le Bon's criticism stems from observing 19th century rote learning in France, rather than the modern model that cultivates independent minds. By this point, we can see that the crowd is not a perfect scripture, but a valuable guide, because its insights help us understand how group dynamics operate, while its limitations remind us not to let the book's ideas control our own thinking. And with all this in mind, the real question becomes, how can ordinary people avoid being swept away by group pressure in real life? And that is what we are going to explore next, as we look at practical ways to stay awake and stay ourselves within any crowd. When you reach this point of the book, some people might feel that since the crowd portrays group behavior in such a negative light, maybe the safest path is to stay away from people entirely and live as a lone outsider. But that's not the real message, because every one of us lives inside groups in one way or another, whether we work with colleagues, live with family, or simply meet friends on the weekend. And Le Bon didn't write this book to make us despise crowds, but to help us understand how they operate. Just as we don't read this book to escape from groups, but to stay grounded within them, to keep ourselves from being dragged by collective emotion or falling into familiar traps. And with that purpose in mind, here are 3 simple but very practical suggestions that can help us stay clear-headed whenever we find ourselves inside a crowd. The first suggestion is that whenever a surge of collective emotion breaks out, you should pause for 10 minutes before reacting. Because when you see a piece of news that instantly triggers anger and notice everyone in the comments shouting the same thing, it's easy to get pulled along without thinking. And when you see people rushing to buy something in a frenzy, your impulse may be to follow them immediately. But giving yourself 10 minutes lets you ask 3 important questions. What is the full truth of this event? Is the information I'm seeing complete? And is my current emotion truly mine, or simply something triggered by others? And just like during the panic buying of salt in the pandemic, if you had paused and asked yourself how long the salt at home would last, and whether experts already explained that supply was stable, you probably wouldn't have joined the panic. Because collective emotion rises quickly and fades quickly, and those 10 minutes of calm can save you from impulsive decisions. The second suggestion is not to treat everyone is doing it as evidence that something is correct, because we often hear phrases like, everyone buys this brand, so it must be good, or everyone says this, so it can't be wrong. But the majority doesn't equal the truth, and what most people choose may be right, but could just as easily be wrong. So if everyone believes that the only stable path is to take the civil service exam, but you're more suited for entrepreneurship, there's no reason to follow them. And if everyone insists that a certain celebrity must be adored, but you don't genuinely like them, you don't need to force yourself to join the trend. And Liban reminds us that group judgment is usually shaped by emotion and suggestion instead of reason. So what really matters is whether something fits you personally, and whether it aligns with your principles, rather than whether it matches what the majority is doing. The third suggestion is to practice critical thinking in your everyday life, so you don't become someone who passively absorbs information. Because when reading the news, you shouldn't stop at the headline or the conclusion, but check whether the source is reliable and whether other viewpoints exist. And when watching short videos, you shouldn't automatically accept a creator's so-called truth, but ask yourself what might be omitted or whether they have a vested interest. And even when people recommend products, instead of trusting everyone says it's good, you should look into whether the product is actually good. Because critical thinking isn't about arguing for the sake of arguing. It's about not believing too quickly and not rejecting too quickly, and using your own logic and evidence to verify. Information is the core skill that prevents you from being manipulated inside any group. And finally, The Crowd isn't a book that teaches us to look down on groups, but a book that teaches us how to protect ourselves. Because understanding how crowds operate isn't about laughing at their flaws, but about staying alert when those same patterns appear around us. And knowing the weaknesses of a crowd isn't so we can exploit them, but so we don't become the ones being exploited. And my hope is that by reading this book, we not only understand crowds more clearly, but also understand our own role within them, so we can enjoy the warmth and power that groups sometimes provide while still holding on to clarity and independence, staying unshaken, resisting the pull of conformity, and living the life we genuinely want. And with all that said, congratulations on finishing another book.